Hello. Thank you for watching the video until the end. My goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe. I would be grateful to you. Let's move on to the story. The gray morning mist enveloped the schoolyard like a dense shroud. Long, gloomy shadows spread across the ground, swallowing the light, and the air was filled with a cold, dreary silence. Today was the last day of school for the graduates, but the joyful expectations that usually accompany this moment seemed distant and non-existent. It felt as if the school itself had absorbed a sinister atmosphere, foreboding something terrible. The gathered students stood in groups, quietly conversing, but there was no joy or excitement in their voices, which usually resonated in the last days of the school year. Alexei, a tall young man with sharp facial features, stood apart from his classmates, anxiously glancing at the empty football field behind the school building. Something intangible troubled him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a dark figure flitting at the edge of the field. "Did you see that too?" asked Masha, approaching Alexei. She was his childhood friend and always noticed when he was worried about something. "I don't know," he replied, still looking at the field. "I thought I saw someone there." Masha looked in the same direction, but there was nothing. At that moment, the bell rang, inviting the students to class. Alexei and Masha headed into the building, leaving their worries in the backyard. Inside the school, it was dark and gloomy. The light filtering through the windows was dim and barely illuminated the corridors. The walls were lined with yellowed photographs of past graduates, making it seem like the school held memories of old events better left forgotten. The classroom was silent. The teacher, an old and wrinkled woman named Anna Pavlovna, stood at the board, ready to start the last lesson. Alexei and Masha took their seats, glancing at their classmates who sat in anticipation. But instead of the usual feeling of joy and relief at the end of the school year, there was a growing tension with each passing minute. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Anna Pavlovna went to open it, and a stranger entered the classroom. He was a tall, gaunt man with a pale face and piercing eyes. He introduced himself as the new deputy principal and said he wanted to say a few words to the graduates. But his voice sounded as if each word cost him immense effort. "Dear graduates," he began, his eyes scanning the rows of students, "you are on the threshold of a new life. But do not forget that the world is full of dangers and mysteries. Sometimes the past does not want to let us go, and we must be ready for unexpected trials." His words sounded ominous, and the silence that hung in the classroom became almost tangible. Alexei felt his heart beat faster. The deputy principal's gaze met his, and in those eyes he saw something cold and frightening. After the man finished his speech and left, Anna Pavlovna resumed the lesson. But the tension in the classroom only grew. The students exchanged glances, whispered, but no one dared to speak out loud. The whole day passed under this pressure, and when the final bell rang, the students spilled out of the classroom, hoping to shake off the oppressive feeling. But something terrible awaited them in the schoolyard. A group of students from the neighboring school, known for their bad temper and tendency to violence, stood at the gates. Their leader, Igor, was tall and muscular, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "Hello, graduates," he said, stepping forward. "Do you think today is your day? Think again." A threat hung in the air, and Alexei felt his hands clench into fists. He knew nothing good would come from this encounter. Igor, he said, trying not to show fear. "Today is not the time for your games." But Igor just smirked in response. His henchmen began to surround the students, cutting off escape routes. Alexei saw the faces of his classmates turn pale with fear. He realized the situation was getting out of control. "We're not here to play," Igor said, his voice full of malice. "Today we'll show you what real horror is." At that moment, chaos erupted. The students from the neighboring school attacked the graduates, and a fight broke out. Screams, punches, pain all mixed into one nightmarish whirl. Alexei tried to defend himself but felt his strength ebbing away. Masha screamed, her eyes full of terror. She tried to run, but one of the attackers grabbed her arm and yanked her back. Alexei, gathering his last bit of strength, rushed to her, but something heavy struck his head, and he lost consciousness. Darkness enveloped him, and the last thing he heard were screams and sounds of struggle. The world plunged into darkness, and in that darkness, Alexei felt something evil and ancient awaken around him. The school seemed to come to life, becoming both witness and participant in this horror. Alexei woke up to a sharp pain in his head and dull sounds coming from somewhere far away. The world was shrouded in a gray haze, and it seemed as if time had stopped. He slowly lifted himself, his body aching with pain, and his head throbbed. The fog before his eyes gradually dissipated, and he saw chaos around him: scattered items, broken school desks and chairs. The air was filled with the sounds of struggle and screams. "Masha," he called, hoping to hear her voice. There was no response. In a panic, Alexei looked around, trying to find his friend. Suddenly, he spotted her lying on the ground nearby. One of the attackers stood over her, his face twisted in a cruel grin. Alexei jumped to his feet despite the pain and rushed at him. He punched the attacker in the face, causing him to stagger back. Alexei grabbed Masha's hand and helped her up. "How are you?" he asked, his voice trembling with anxiety. "Not good, but I'll manage," she replied, barely standing. "We need to get out of here." Together, they ran down the corridor, trying to get as far away from the site of the attack as possible. The school was empty, but the silence seemed even more sinister than the screams and noise of the fight. They could hear echoes of footsteps and voices of the attackers, but couldn't tell where they were coming from. "Where do we go?" Masha whispered, her eyes full of fear. "The basement," Alexei suggested. "There's an exit to the back door there. Maybe we can get out." They carefully moved through the corridors, trying not to attract attention. The dim light from the lamps flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. The school seemed to come alive, its walls whispering something incoherent and frightening. Alexei felt something ancient and evil awakening around them, as if the school itself were a living entity full of hatred and pain. When they reached the door leading to the basement, Alexei cautiously opened it, and they began to descend the steep stairs. Below, they were met with complete darkness. Alexei found a switch and flicked it, but there was no light. The lamps were broken, and the only source of light was their phones. The basement was filled with the musty smell of mold and dampness. Alexei and Masha slowly moved forward, lighting their way with their phones. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. Alexei turned and saw shadows flitting in the dim light. His heart beat faster, and they quickened their pace. But the further they went, the more they felt something was wrong. They came to the school's old archive, a large room filled with old documents, books, and boxes. Alexei and Masha stopped to catch their breath. "We can hide here for a while," Alexei whispered. "We need to come up with a plan." Masha nodded, her face pale with fear. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the darkness, and they froze. Shadows began to move around them, and it seemed as if the walls were closing in, trying to swallow them. Igor emerged from the darkness, his eyes burning with madness. He smiled as he approached. "Do you think you can escape?" His voice was a hiss. "The school won't let you go." Alexei and Masha tried to retreat but hit the walls. The shadows thickened around them, and a cold penetrated every cell of their bodies. Suddenly, several more attackers jumped out of the darkness, grabbing their arms and legs. Resistance was futile; they were immobilized. Igor came closer and looked directly into Alexei's eyes. "Today you'll learn what real horror means," he whispered, his voice echoing through the basement. "This day will be remembered forever." Suddenly, the air was filled with sinister sounds, as if moans and whispers were emerging from the depths of the school. The walls began to vibrate, and it seemed as if the ground beneath their feet was trembling. The shadows became thick and dense like ink, and Alexei realized that something incredibly evil had awakened here. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to split open, revealing a black abyss. Alexei and Masha, shackled by the iron grip of their tormentors, stared into this bottomless chasm, from which emanated ancient cold and terror. "Welcome to hell," Igor sneered, and in his eyes, Alexei saw true madness. Darkness swallowed them, and the world around them turned into a nightmare. Alexei and Masha felt something cold and sinister pulling them down, deep into the school, where ancient and malevolent secrets were hidden. They screamed, but their screams were lost in this dreadful darkness, which seemed endless. The darkness became their new reality, and in this bottomless pit, Alexei realized that their trials were just beginning. The evil awakened in the school was ancient and merciless, and its goal was clear: to consume their souls and leave them in eternal torment. With each moment, the world around them became more distorted, and Alexei felt hope slipping away. But he wasn't going to give up. Even in this darkness, he knew he had to fight to the end, for himself and for Masha. The dark forces awakened on this last day of school were relentless, and their sinister intentions were yet to be fully revealed. Alexei and Masha had to find a way to escape this nightmare and stop the evil that had engulfed their school. The darkness surrounding Alexei and Masha was dense and unbearable. They were falling into a bottomless pit, feeling cold and horror penetrating every cell of their bodies. Around them were moans and screams, as if the school itself were crying out in agony. Alexei held Masha's hand tightly, trying to maintain some semblance of hope, but the sense of doom grew stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the fall stopped, and they found themselves on solid ground. Around them was darkness, interrupted only by the flickering light of old, almost extinguished candles. Before them opened a sinister hall filled with ancient symbols and black altars. The air was filled with the smell of burning and decay. Igor and his henchmen stood before them, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the candles. Igor's eyes gleamed with madness and triumph. "Welcome to the heart of the school," he hissed. "This is where its true power resides." Alexei and Masha tried to stand, but their bodies were too weak. They realized their chances of escape were diminishing with each passing second. "Why are you doing this?" Alexei managed to utter, his voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "The school demands sacrifices," Igor replied coldly. "Its power feeds on fear and pain. You will become part of its eternal cycle." Masha sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Alexei tried to comfort her, but knew their chances of escape were slim. Suddenly, he remembered an old legend his grandmother had told him, a legend about an ancient evil that devoured the souls of young people. "We have to find a way to stop them," he whispered to Masha. "We can't give up." But their hopes were dashed when Igor approached them with a ritual knife in his hand. His face was full of crazed determination. "Today we complete this ritual," he said, "and the school will gain new strength." Alexei felt the cold metal touch his skin and realized that his life now hung by a thread. In that moment, all his strength was focused on one thing: to protect Masha. With sudden fury, he broke free from the attacker's grasp and lunged at Igor. Their struggle was brief but fierce. Alexei grabbed the knife and plunged it into Igor's arm, forcing him to retreat. Masha, seizing the moment, began searching for an exit, but around them was only darkness and walls that seemed impassable. Igor screamed in pain and rage. His henchmen pounced on Alexei, disarming him. But something in the hall began to change. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air filled with eerie sounds. "You've awakened its wrath," Igor screamed, his voice filled with horror. "The school demands your blood." Suddenly, the walls began to close in, and dark shadows descended upon them, consuming everything in their path. Alexei realized they had lost, but he couldn't let Masha die. He embraced her, trying to shield her from the advancing darkness. "Forgive me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't save you." Masha clung to him, her body trembling with fear. "I love you," she whispered. The darkness enveloped them, consuming the last rays of light. Alexei felt their bodies dissolving in this horror, as the school devoured their souls. The last thing he heard was the whisper of ancient evil, satisfied with its victory. Everything became silence and void. The school, sated with its sacrifices, fell asleep again. Alexei and Masha disappeared, their souls becoming part of its eternal nightmare. Silence once again reigned in the corridors and halls, with only the walls whispering ancient secrets, holding memories of lost souls. The next school year, no one remembered what had happened. The school continued its life, welcoming new students who had no idea of the evil lurking in its depths. But sometimes on quiet nights, one could hear moans and screams coming from the depths of the school, reminding of those who would never leave its walls. And so the school continued its endless cycle, feeding on fear and pain, until new victims came to replace those who had already become part of it.